Dr. Anthony Fauci hammered critics, including Elon Musk, for suggesting that he should be prosecuted. CNN's Jim Acosta read a tweet that Musk posted in December of last year, reading, quote, "My pronouns are prosecute Fauci." This was his response when asked about it on Acosta's program over the weekend. Let's watch.
Well, I mean, there's no response to that craziness, Jim. I mean, prosecute me for what? What are they talking about? I mean, I wish I could figure out what the heck they were talking about. I think they're just going off the deep end. That's the answer to your first question. It doesn't make any sense to say something like that, and it actually is irresponsible. Of course, it's going to have a difficult effect and a deleterious effect on my family. I mean, they don't like to have me getting death threats all the time. Every time somebody gets up and spouts some nonsense that's misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies, somebody somewhere decides they want to do harm to me and or my family.
Now, Fauci has been the target of many Republicans, especially since the start of the pandemic. Recently, he's received even more criticism as U.S. agencies finally concurred that a lab leak was likely what led to COVID-19 and the pandemic. So what do you make of this? Is it fair for Fauci to push back and say, prosecute me for what? Is this a meaningful inquiry into some actual legal wrongdoing on my part? Or is this Republicans trying to basically politically exploit what might be, real mistakes that were made during the pandemic, but not criminal action?
So I think it is premature to prosecute Fauci for anything. And I want to be careful here because a lot of people were saying that back when they were just, opposing mask mandates, social distancing, other things. I also oppose all those things. I think that was advice that Fauci gave in his role as a health advisor. I think it was not advice I agree with. I don't think legitimate policy disputes are grounds for prosecuting him. So the case for holding him accountable in some kind of criminal context has to do with the funding of the research and what he said about it. Now, you actually, just before we started the segment, pointed me to some reporting that my own magazine, Reason, has done on this subject. Bonnie Christian, who writes for Reason, contacted the offices of several Republicans who had engaged positively with this Prosecute Fauci tweet. And Senator Ted Cruz, Senator Rand Paul indicated, to the extent that they responded to this inquiry, that yes, they're looking at it from a did he lie to Congress standpoint when he said that we're not doing gain of function research, or the pause was obeyed, and then you get into those arguments he had with Rand Paul about the specific nature of how you would categorize the research we did. I think it is not wild to think that he misstated what was being done. I think we need further investigation before there would be any sort of thing along those lines. I don't think it's crazy to suggest that there was misconduct based on what we now know. I listened to that deposition where he, for hours, talked about how, despite the pause on gain-of-function research, he maybe repeatedly signed off on an exception, and then he wasn't sure what exactly he'd signed off on. There are very legitimate questions to be had here. Is it premature to prosecute him? Yes. That doesn't mean we won't get there. Yeah,
your colleague points out that they have to prove not only that there was, in fact, research that can be characterized as gain-of-function research, but that Fauci knew about it and purposefully lied to get something like a federal perjury charge to stick. And it is worth noting that most of the people that she reached out to, the journalist reached out to, I think none of the representatives responded. And Ted Cruz wouldn't commit to the idea that a federal perjury charge is what they're actually after. I think Rand Paul was the one that was most responsive, and that seems like what they're after. So again, the question is, you saw that Fauci's response there seemed to indicate that he believes this is ratcheting up threats to his life, security threats, those kinds of things. And I do think that there's a kind of pattern of, lock her up, throw Hillary in jail, this idea that prosecute Fauci is going to lead to him behind bars in a way that's very satisfying to people who are frustrated with his role over the last 2 years. And does using that kind of language satisfy a kind of bloodlust that's not really connected to what would happen even if he were prosecuted for, let's say, a perjury charge?
I don't know. I hear what you're saying, and in a lot of these cases, including the Hillary Clinton case, right, there was a lot of political bloodlust, as you just put it. In the Fauci case, look, I don't know. I'm keeping an open mind. What we're learning about the funding of the research and then that period when Fauci seems to have first had the idea that, could this have come out of a lab? Who are my people on that? And then seemed to push them in a direction of deciding it was not a lab leak, including, it sounds like, actually commissioning that scientist to write a report saying it's not lab leak, which he then cited in a press conference without admitting that he had pressed for that report to be written that way. We're starting to get into some there are huge stakes here. There were only millions of people who died as a result of this pandemic. So I don't know. Obviously, everyone deserves due process. He is entitled to the full benefit of due process and an assumption of non-guilt and et cetera, et cetera. And I would want to, really rigorously investigate this before we proceed in any direction. But I don't know. I think there might be a there, frankly. Yeah,
it looks like the maximum perjury penalties are up to 5 years. Who actually gets real jail time for perjury is a very interesting question, and whether or not people think that is well matched to what he's been accused of is another interesting question.
If he said something wrong at a hearing, right, that's not the biggest deal in the world, but that would be. Again, that would be holding him accountable if it does turn out to be the case that our research had something to do with what happened with COVID.
That's the word, right? I think it's legitimate for people to be looking for accountability somewhere. The crisis was horrible, and people suffered.
The harms are incalculable.
And that's so while I understand the impulse, it does feel a little bit like a maybe misdirected. It's not to say that Fauci isn't responsible for the role that he played in this, but it also very much does seem like there was a much bigger cover-up. It's the people who were both funding EcoHealth and going and doing press in the weeks after the pandemic emerged saying it absolutely couldn't have been a lab leak. It's the people who potentially destroyed evidence that could have actually pointed to what happened here.
If a drunk driver crashed into the van carrying the vials of COVID and they spilled out, we had a pandemic because of that, you'd want to hold that person accountable.
But even in that example,
or the damage beyond just a car crash.
Sure, but even that example, that person's judgment proof. That truck driver can't pay for the trillions of dollars in economic damage and death that have been the consequence of the COVID pandemic. So on some level, the problem here is that there is always going to be a mismatch between how much any of the individuals responsible can be held accountable versus the need for people to be made whole. And unfortunately, while we should be talking about how to make people whole, I don't think it's going to be from the people who actually, it's not possible to draw those resources from the people who are responsible. Although I would like to take a much closer look at the role the pharmaceutical industries and the like played, because those are actual deep pockets.
The harm here is so vast, and people are correct to be starting to connect these dots and saying, wait, what were we funding?
Yeah.
Why is this? Why are the government health advisors in the pharmaceutical industry so hesitant about answering any of our questions about these things? Why were they so evasive? It really does. It is concerning. As Marjorie Taylor Greene said in response to the Elon, my pronouns are prosecute Fauci tweet, she said, I affirm your pronouns, Elon.
Oh, we got one.
It's funny.
One affirmation
there you go.
of someone's identity.
More rising right after this.